May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Today, Jesus tells us that salt that has lost its taste is worse than pointless. In fact, he gets kind of dramatically angry about this salt, kind of offended, a little bit salty. I know that was a cheap joke, but come on. It says it's good for nothing other than to throw it on the ground and to trample it. What's the point of salt if it's not salty? Similarly, if you take a lamp and light it and then hide it away, that's absurd. No one would do that. The point of salt is to be salty. The point of light is to shine brightly. And the point of being a follower of Christ is to follow so boldly that it is unmistakable who we follow. Be bright, be bold, be salty. That's the commandment we get today. When I think about organizations and groups that are growing right now and attracting people, one of the things they seem to me to have in common is that they have a clear purpose. They stand up for something. They have a distinct flavor, and they advertise what that is. People know what they're about. Now, sometimes these groups and organizations have such a hateful, unjust flavor that we wish they weren't growing. But unfortunately, often the church's response is not to become more bold and more bright and more salty, but instead to become kind of bland. We become so afraid of losing the few we have that we hold on tight and do not speak what needs to be spoken. We do not say who we are. We do not shine with the light of Christ. We are bland. We are like the irrelevant social club that Martin Luther King Jr. talked about in Letter from a Birmingham jail, which we watched part of last week. Be bold, be bright, be salty. Okay, so we need to have a flavor. We need to be bold. But what does that mean exactly? How do we follow Christ? At the end of our reading in Matthew today, Christ says that we need to have righteousness. What does that mean? Fortunately, Jesus does not leave us in the dark about this. Not long after, a little further down in Matthew, Jesus tells the story of the goats and the sheep. Several people come to Jesus wanting to be let into his kingdom, and he denies them entry. Why does he deny them? Not because they couldn't believe enough, not because their theology was off, not because they held the wrong doctrines or creeds, but because they did not feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit those in prison, care for the sick, and welcome the stranger. And then Jesus, in our reading today, goes on to tell us that he has not come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them, and says that we need to keep the commandments. Well, if you've read the commandments like I have, there are hundreds of them. What are we supposed to keep? Which ones? Well, Jesus makes this clear too. Not too far further in Matthew, Jesus says, these are the two greatest commandments. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, and with all your soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. On these two things hang all of the law and prophets. That's what we're supposed to be bold about. That's the flavor we're supposed to have. Love of God, love of neighbor. And then we get one of these prophets that Jesus has talked about in our reading from Isaiah. Perhaps similar to those who are wanting entry into Jesus' kingdom, the people of God are wanting God on their side and are wondering where God is. They're doing all the right things. They're engaged in all the right religious acts. They're fasting. They're lying in ashcloth and sacks of ashcloth and covering themselves in ashes. They're doing what they believe they're supposed to do to follow God, and yet, where is God? And God says not nice things about this kind of religion. God is clear that a religion without heart, religion without love, religion without justice is not what God desires. Instead, what God desires is a fast that looses the bonds of injustice, a fast that brings up the heavy yoke of oppression and pulls it off of the shoulders of those who are so weighed down. What does God desire? A fast that is fairness to workers, that feeds the hungry, that houses the unhoused, that seeks justice, that seeks kindness, that seeks mercy. That is what God desires from God's people. Love God, love neighbor. The world is in desperate need of loud voices of love, of bold voices for justice. There is a time to be quiet. There is. There is a time when it is appropriate to do our acts of kindness and justice and goodwill anonymously. But Jesus says there is also a time to do them boldly and brightly so that we cannot, not to glorify ourselves, but to point to God. Our world is right now in desperate need of knowing the God who loves all, of knowing the God who authored justice, who calls for justice for all. Our world is in desperate need of knowing the Christ who redeems and heals, who seeks to reconcile us and our whole world to one another and to our God of infinite love. Now is the time to be bold about love, to be bold about justice, to be bold about who we are and what we stand for. Not just with our voices, but with our lives. As Isaiah reminds us, to live lives of justice, to live lives of serving others, to be loud with our voices, to be loud with our lives. We have something the world needs. The church has something the world needs. But people will only come if we are authentic, if we are real, if we know who we are and what we stand for, and we speak that boldly and clearly and with love. Now is the time to shine. So let's go out, let's be bold, let's be bright, and let's be a little salty. Amen.